Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, I spoke with two members of No More Deaths, or No Más Muertes, a 20-year-old humanitarian organization operating in the borderlands between Mexico and the USA. We talked about the organization, the work it does, how the border has changed, the political legacy of the Republicans and Democrats in the current situation for immigration, deaths at the border, and ways to get involved in supporting people on the move. You can find links in our show notes to some groups mentioned in the conversation.
Camino que detrás desaparece.
Hi, I'm Ari. I use she, her pronouns. I usually live in Tucson, Arizona, and I volunteer with the aid group No Más Muertes, No More Deaths.
My name is Bryce, he, him. Also volunteer for No Más Muertes, No More Deaths, but also volunteer for the Tucson Samaritans and some other groups.
What brought you two into organizing around the border and around human rights?
I think I first got interested in doing humanitarian aid from seeing other friends going down to the border and doing work in the southern Arizona borderlands, and also some family connection to migration crossing through the Mexico border. And it felt like a really tangible way to get involved and support people who are still crossing through.
5 years ago, I ended up riding freight trains in Mexico. It was during Trump's border shutdown. And so I saw a lot of people riding north from Central America and just the kind of horrible things they went through in Mexico and then directly at the border. And yeah, whole dramatic thing, but got really interested in trying to figure out ways to do direct action on the US side once I came across, and yeah, kind of found out about No More Deaths and other groups working, and started trying to get involved once I had moved to Tucson.
Yeah, I guess, would you all tell people a little bit about No Más Muertes or No More Deaths and its history and what the group does?
Yeah, I can start on that. We began working in the southern Arizona borderlands in 2004, I believe. No More Deaths was formed by a coalition of a bunch of different faith groups and aid groups that were working at the time to support people migrating over and seeking refuge. It was supported by a lot of churches, and I think this is what has given No More Deaths specifically a lot of support over the years and like legal protection to do the humanitarian aid that we still do to this day, 20 years later, which, has been really, really helpful. Our main mission is to stop death and suffering in the borderlands. The ways that we do that look like running a humanitarian aid camp for folks who are crossing through the desert to get water, food, medical relief, and we also do water drops in the Sonoran Desert. That stretches from Ajo in the Western Desert to around south of Tucson in the Aravaca corridor. And now in present day, in the last year and a half or so, we've been doing work further out towards El Paso in New Mexico region, doing a bunch of exploratories out there. No More Deaths also runs a hotline for folks who are crossing through the desert who have either gotten lost or loved ones who have lost people in the desert to call in and support with that. Yeah. Am I missing anything, Bryce?
I think one thing that I think often gets brought up about the history of the organization is just at the beginning, it kind of came out of Humane Borders. Humane Borders was making deals with government agencies and things to try to for advocacy and also for other kinds of direct aid. And then Tucson Samaritans kind of split off from them to be searching for people directly in the desert. And then No More Deaths ended up splitting off from them just out of a need to have a group that has more of a, I don't know the word for it, that has more of a antagonistic relationship with Border Patrol that specifically avoids contact with Border Patrol and is willing to maybe take more risks and things like that, and to kind of not be as friendly. Because Tucson Samaritans and Humane Borders, like, part of their strength is that they are kind of willing to like speak to Border Patrol on certain things, or like advocate for certain things or whatever. And No More Deaths really exists as a little bit of a counter to that. And one other thing that we do is kind of the more vocal witness to things that go on in the desert. So over the years, we've had quite a few reports come out that document some of the abuses of Border Patrol in the borderlands through direct research, through like our hotline and other things, just kind of showing some of the human rights abuses that happen out in the desert.
Yeah, and I think that adds to like what Bryce was saying of like the antagonistic sort of nature, I think, of No More Deaths in comparison to a lot of other aid groups, specifically in Southern Arizona, is that like we are so linked to our team who does what is called abuse documentation, and very simply, named for what it is, which is documenting abuses of Border Patrol and state officials in creating, a very hostile environment of death and deterrence for people crossing the borderlands. So inherently, puts us on a side with law enforcement that I think other groups aren't on,
And so this is I didn't realize that this is the 20th anniversary of the organization. That's pretty awesome. I mean, it's also pretty tragic, right? For this sort of organizing to feel like that it's still necessary after 20 years of doing this direct action, direct support on the border area. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to say about that anniversary.
It is a shame that we are celebrating our 20th anniversary. And at the same time, it is pretty amazing that we still have the support over 20 years in organizing in like a world of like what we're doing that is so exhausting and really hard for so many people, to still see this project through. And I think a lot of us can't wait for the day that, we don't have to be doing this. And I hope that's the case for so many other humanitarian aid groups doing aid along the border. But until then, we will still be here, and hopefully everyone else will be leaving water in the desert and doing cool things that help people.
Yeah, I recently went out with somebody who was around for the first couple of years of No More Deaths, and I actually kind of asked him a similar question. And he said, yeah, right at the beginning that, because the deaths started as a direct result of the prevention through deterrence policy, which was a policy that like happened. It like that, it's not like the deaths gradually like started or whatever. It just started happening as a direct result. And so he said right at the beginning, in the first few years, people were talking about it as something that was only going to last for a couple of years. And so they were like, going really hard with the understanding that like, okay, once this is over, we make our statement. Once the deaths stop, then we can stop doing this. And so the fact that we've been here for 20 years really makes the name No More Deaths feel like, yeah, almost depressing for, it just kind of keeps going, and more restrictive policies keep getting instituted. And yeah,
I've been kind of curious about like, Bryce named like a group that included the word Samaritan in the name. I've always kind of understood that No More Deaths is like aligned with like progressive or maybe like liberation theology reading of Catholicism, and probably that groups that would, folks that would be involved in Catholic worker type organizing might also be involved in this. I'm not sure about y'all's faith or lack of, but I wonder if you can say anything about like some of the religious orientations that are involved in this sort of practice and this organizing. And like, I guess you did mention that it sort of allowed for the organization to have this sort of staying power, but like what kind of cultural cachet that otherwise allows this organizing to happen under? Does that make sense? I sort of like mixed up a bunch of words there, word salad, but
Ari could probably answer that way better than me, but there are some actual Catholic workers involved for sure. So yeah, it definitely attracts just the exact type of people you're talking about.
I also think that, like the type of volunteer that has been attracted to this work over, the last 20 years has changed a lot. As we've seen things just get worse in the desert and militarization continue to get worse. There is such a mixed bag of people doing desert aid, and it's people who have religious affiliations and so many people who do not, who do this for reasons because they want, same reasons that someone who is doing it for their religious affiliation is, which is a pretty special thing that so many different folks are able to come together to do this, since especially at the beginning of this organizing, it was so centered around religious affiliation and beliefs. And as we continue to watch that change, I think we're in it for the better. We're seeing so many different people come through.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, though, that even if the culture has shifted away from primarily being focused in that sort of activism, that folks that do experience the world in that way still find a home in that sort of activity, and find it that it resonates with their values. It's already been talked about how the border has shifted over this period of time, or that the border has shifted over this period of time. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the border itself, a little bit about the unchecked power of the Border Patrol and how the U.S. government, as one zine on the subject called it, was designed to kill at that border.
Every day, the border becomes more militarized. We see that with border technology, with surveillance towers that stretch, 20 miles out from the physical border itself. We see that with physical barriers, whether that's in the form of old Normandy barriers that have been around for a long time, or the new border wall, which started under Trump. And a lot of people, I think, don't recognize that it's still happening under Biden. The most border wall construction, I believe, has happened under the Biden administration. Every day when we go down to the wall, there is, a new stretch of border wall that is being erected. And that looks like taking down mountains that have been there for time immemorial to erect this. That stretches all along the border. Yeah. Bryce, do you want to talk about infrastructure border-wise more?
So the border policy we have now is quite literally, as you said, designed to kill. It started, or 1993 started with Operation Hold the Line in El Paso, where they had a line of Border Patrol agents just in the city, so people just actually couldn't cross because there was a line of Border Patrol agents just standing there. There was evidence actually that this strategy just kind of didn't actually work, but it was really popular, and they took it on as a border-wide strategy that they called prevention of deterrence. And in the policy itself, it says that ideally people would die, and I don't know, their families would talk to people, the news would get around, and then people wouldn't want to come anymore. But it's literally stated in the policy, and that's only been strengthened over time. They've pushed people out of the cities towards more dangerous areas. But I think something that started happening more recently that I think is kind of underappreciated is that the militarization has gotten so intense now that just the idea that people are having to cross out in the middle of nowhere kind of isn't really the thing anymore, because there's been so much criminalization and militarization to the point where even not in the middle of the nowhere, even very close to a town, for example, some places in Texas or El Paso or New Mexico, where deaths have increased drastically recently, you can be in a populated area, and because there's so much Border Patrol, because it's the consequences are so high for being deported or for having to re-enter, that you essentially can't seek help even in a populated area. You can be in a town and be afraid to ask for water. People be afraid to give you water because people helping people are afraid of being criminalized. So it's really just this whole zone of borderlands where if you're an undocumented person, if you're in the process of migration, you essentially don't have a right to life. And over the past 20 years, the border budget has just increased exponentially.
Considering the possibility that you've come into contact with people facing immediate health concerns after making the long trek across the border, who may need higher levels of care than you can provide, like you mentioned, people being afraid to ask for water. Can you talk a bit about how interacting with hospitals, paramedics, and other organizations that interact or work alongside of law enforcement, like how that interfaces with your work? Any like ways that you've had to change the way that you navigate around that, or any ways that hospitals or paramedics or whoever have sort of like shifted in their policies or practices?
Yeah, I think this is just me getting caught on the wording, but I think it's like less how we interact or like avoid those systems, but more how people migrating make their decisions based upon, like what the repercussions of seeking care are, if that makes sense. So, it's not our say, to take someone to the hospital or to not take someone to the hospital. It's someone's say to be like, if I go to the hospital, I'm going to get deported. And we see that happen all the time, whether someone has a small injury or is on the verge of death. And I think this plays into a big problem that we see a lot. And it came out in a recent abuse documentation that we put out, just about the lack of emergency services for migrants as well. And that's, when people are out in the desert and they make a call to 911 in search of a rescue. If that was someone who is a documented U.S. citizen, there would be a search team. There would be a SAR activated for that person almost immediately. There would be this like valiant effort put in to saving someone who has documentation, and we just don't see that across the board with migrants. There was something recent that happened, I believe, in San Diego, or outside of San Diego, with a woman who was on the border wall crossing over. She had fell from the border wall and died. I believe she was like 20 years old. I can't remember her name. It was just an utter lack of care. There were agents on the ground. They were filming the entire interaction. And things like this happen every single day on a smaller scale. But that is such a drastic, view of like someone crossing over the border wall, help being right there and help not being able to help someone. And I think that is the biggest problem that folks crossing the desert interface with a lot when it comes to seeking medical services, is that they're either not going to get it or they're too scared to ask for it because of the repercussions.
Yeah, and just to double down on that statement, it's like there's the occasional like dramatic cases like that make the news, but it's really like an instituted policy. Like if you call 911, and it's not just like not being documented, it's if you call 911 in the borderlands and you're speaking Spanish, or the dispatcher even like has a hint that maybe you're in the process of crossing the border, then they just transfer you to Border Patrol. And then Border Patrol, more often than not, will just drop the call, or if they can't get like exact coordinates right away, they'll just say, okay, well, we can't come. And then the person is shit out of luck. And that's just, that's like the time when a person is at their most desperate. That's at the point at which somebody is going to die and they're just completely left out. And it's not just that Border Patrol makes themselves the only responder for these things, and then to a problem that they themselves caused, and then they don't actually respond to it. So there's also a system in place where if a emergency responder responds to a migrant, that they are supposed to get money from Border Patrol, and the idea is that they bring the person to Border Patrol afterwards, and if they don't bring people to Border Patrol, then they don't get paid for doing the emergency response. So it kind of gets this sort of like snitching gets instituted, where people know, even if people know the right thing to do, not just like ethically or morally, but medically, is to take somebody to the hospital, to not call Border Patrol, because if they get deported, that, before having received higher medical care, they're going to have further, if not lifelong, medical issues. in order to even just have the funding necessary to do emergency response, they kind of have to send people to Border Patrol. And so we've seen, like, in our area, just really horrible things. Like, we've come into contact with people with horrible injuries only to find that they've been deported the same day. And it's really like it's not an abstract thing. It's like every single day this is happening across the border. And just quick counterpoint to that, in the El Paso area, Sunland Park, New Mexico, the fire department there doesn't do this. When they need Border Patrol's help, they will ask for Border Patrol. They do collaborate with Border Patrol, but they've been on record saying that they very specifically don't take money from Border Patrol. They're like, they take forever to pay us. Often they usually just don't even pay us at all. So why bother? We're just gonna start handling this ourselves. And they don't ask people's immigration status. They show up to every single 911 call. And once they pick people up, they still don't ask. They just give them whatever medical care they need. So it really shows, like, there's no law saying that this is the way that it has to be. It can change at any moment if local authorities and medical responders just actually have the desire to help.
Yeah, and I think to that point of, like, there's no law saying that, there is also, like, laws directly saying that you cannot give or not give someone medical care based upon their migration status. Like, that is a very explicit thing. Like, Border Patrol finds ways to make themselves the first responder. Like, they find ways to not allow people to get access to the things they need. And that's the way that they do it in the southern Arizona borderlands. And it has led to countless deaths and people not receiving the care they need, or people getting deported really quickly after with their same injuries into the place where they came fleeing from, or into a new city that they've never been to with a broken leg or, like, internal bleeding or something. You know, it's just, yeah, so many people are leaving here so much more hurt than they came.
And one more thing, we can move on, but to what Ari said about being deported with a broken leg. In New Mexico and El Paso and California, this is kind of like a new problem that also is, like, very different from the sort of prevention through deterrence narrative that we've had for the past 20 years or 30 years. Since the construction of the higher border walls, the amount of people getting traumatic brain injury or spinal injuries from falling off the border wall has just been astronomical. There's only one person in California who's been releasing some of this data for California, but just from, like, anecdotal evidence and from the death data in El Paso, New Mexico, it seems like the problem is even higher over there potentially. And these are people who, like, often were coming here because they were hoping to be a source of income for a struggling family. And now they get deported with just completely devastating injuries where they then become a financial burden on their family. And this problem is, like, the amount of people, there's, like, not really numbers on the amount of people this is happening to, but it's, like, it's just astronomical right now.
The sort of that really reminds me of the way that police generally in the U.S. have interceded in all sorts of circumstances, creating more deadly moments for people that are having, you know, as public health infrastructure gets defunded, then what, like, immediate emergency response to mental health crises or even just medical calls gets, like, starts including law enforcement, who end up becoming arbiters for, like, funding distribution, and then lead to more deaths of people. Generally, this seems kind of, like, not disconnected from that trend. And it's, like, it's inspiring to hear about that fire department in New Mexico actually being like, no, this is bullshit. Like, it's not even doing what it says it's supposed to do, and we're just going to do what like we are called to do. Like, despite all the like jurisdictional and funding medical neglect. I mean, outside of that example, have there been any sort of collective medical professional responses to this pattern that's been set up from, like, nurses or doctors who are claiming that this, I mean, because clearly the people the dispatchers, the Border Patrol probably a lot of the other intermediaries who are determining whether or not Border Patrol or medical professionals show up to a situation don't take the Hippocratic Oath and don't have that same legal responsibility that's so clear to people in healthcare. Do you hear any sort of like pushback from medical professionals around this issue?
Well, we have doctors and nurses who obviously push back on that. There's been, on the first responder level, I don't know a whole lot of people on the first responder level aside from, in the New Mexico, El Paso area, the search and rescue team, because the amount of deaths is just gone up a lot more recently there. So there kind of hasn't been time for people to get used to like the status quo. And I've spoken with the county sheriff search and rescue team there, and they've kind of like witnessed some of this happening of like kind of not being able to go out on a search because it's quote unquote Border Patrol's jurisdiction, which is not true, and seeing them be like kind of horrified about what's going on. And I think there's definitely like a push for that to change. And then, just doctors. There's an ER doctor in El Paso, Brian Elmore, who's been talking about some of this. And then another ER doctor in San Diego, Alexander Tenorio, who has been trying to like kind of put a call out about the falls from the border wall and things like that.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of medical responders within No More Deaths. So as being a humanitarian aid group, we have so many people who are either nurses or doctors or, who are woofer trained, et cetera. So our personal response, we do as much as we can in the field or at our aid camp or along the border wall to support people until they can get to further medical care. But a lot of the time, the things that we're dealing with is severe dehydration on top of, pre-existing medical conditions that people have had crossing over the border. A lot of the time when people are crossing, sometimes they don't have access to medication that they were consistently taking when they were at home. So, there's so little that we can actually do in the field when it comes to someone who's been in medical distress for either 5 days or 2 weeks, who's been exerting themselves, not drinking enough water, not taking in enough food. Yeah, I think we saw this in a really tragic way this wintertime along the border wall. There was a really big influx in folks crossing, seeking asylum along the U.S.-Mexico border. And every day we were going out. We set up another humanitarian aid station there with tents and structures for folks, kind of like a rapid response medical team to support folks down there, going down every day, cooking meals, and triaging with the Aravaca Fire Department to get people out when they were in dire medical distress. And I think something that a lot of us saw firsthand was that, when we make calls to 911, even if we are U.S. citizens who are speaking English, we immediately get transferred to Border Patrol because of our location and because, we say that we're with migrants or asylum seekers. They will peg the question of, do you know if they're documented or not? You can try to avoid it as much as you can because it doesn't matter, and they'll still redirect you to Border Patrol. And that leaves you with, a response time that could be up to 2 hours for a child who is having a seizure or something. So I think this winter specifically, like a lot of us really stepped up in regards of, triaging with emergency services to get people the care they need. And when the emergency services wouldn't respond to us, taking people to the hospitals ourselves and supporting people through navigating that really bureaucratic, frustrating system of healthcare in the U.S. as an undocumented person and as someone who has also just crossed the desert.
Ari said response time of 2 hours, but there was often response times of like 3 or 4 days or just not showing up. The kind of near the beginning of people coming through the wall there, we'd very regularly run into diabetic people with broken legs, children with heart problems, kidney problems, 10-year-old child that hadn't been able to urinate for over 3 days and was just stuck in the cold in the middle of the desert. And
I forgot about the pregnant woman who was out along the border wall going into labor for like 6 hours.
Yeah. And with a New York Times or whatever horrible newspaper they were at, was there. And all right, what did Border Patrol tell the reporter? Do you remember?
Yeah, I was in Tucson, and I was trying to get Border Patrol to go out to support this person who had a 5-year-old child with her. She had just crossed over. I don't think she spoke Spanish. I believe she was from North Africa. And she was pregnant, 9 months pregnant, and she believed she was going into labor. And I forget what the Border Patrol agent said. Oh, he said that, something about if her water has not broken, then she's not in labor, and that they're not going to rush or something like that. It was just like an extremely confusing, frustrating situation of, just I think a lot of us advocating for people who we know need support under a system that is constantly and consistently trying to not support people. And we see that all across the border. We see that now. People saw that 10 years ago, and, we're going to continue to witness this type of disregard for people's basic medical needs unless something changes.
Yeah, I think the quote I was thinking of is Border Patrol told the reporter, "Oh, you should write about this. It would make a really good story." While they were not responding to a medical emergency, and it just really showed they do not care about even the on the ground, even the image of being even just doing the very basic minimum to stop somebody from dying. They'll even make a joke like that to a reporter. So it's just the things we saw in the winter really really dialed in the degree to which the fact that Border Patrol will say individually, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, no, we don't want people to die, all this stuff or whatever." And some people kind of fall for that or think "Oh, well, some Border Patrol agents are mean, but mostly they're good" or whatever. This is seeing an instituted there's Border Patrol agents on the ground, and they're not gonna pick up a 10-year-old with horrible health problems. Just absurd things that you never thought you would see here,
Or the extension of that logic of well, we don't want you to die, so you shouldn't come because this is a dangerous place.
Yeah, exactly.
I know that as you've already stated, people come away from these instances with long-term negative physical effects from medical neglect or from the injuries that they've gotten along the way and the lack of medical care afterwards. Plus, I'm sure any number of mental health crises compounding on that. And so that just to say that death is not the only measure for the harm that's caused by U.S. border policy and by the actions of these institutions. And I know that with borders, there's no sort of real definite number of deaths that can be attributed, but I wonder what are the sort of numbers that if somebody asks how many people die on the U.S.-Mexico border every year around Aravaca or Ajo or these other places, do you have a number and sort of how do you figure that number?
Yeah, so I guess I first want to state that all of the known about migrant deaths are incredibly off. There's some folks that believe the number is 3 to 7 times higher than what is recorded. Humane Borders in Arizona, another aid group we talked about earlier, presents a map every month. They update it monthly with known migrant deaths. And it's a really helpful resource. It's incredibly important for us as aid workers to see where people are dying so we can address where we need to support people, what routes are being used a lot or where is there a need. And it's also just an incredibly important form of or important research for people to see what is happening in Arizona. I believe in 2023, there was 197 migrants who died while crossing the borderlands just in Arizona alone. Like I said, that number is most definitely probably 3 to 7 times higher. I know there was a search we had gone out on and found a woman, and she had likely been there for over 6 months. So a lot of the times these numbers, it's just when a person got found, but not how many people actually died that year. In 2024, right now, on the Humane Borders map, we're at 95 cases. But yeah, so many people have not been found. So many people still remain missing. Yeah. Bryce, do you want to talk about the numbers in El Paso, New Mexico?
Yeah, we Muertes actually put together a similar resource that as the Humane Borders one for the El Paso area, because another thing in addition to like, these are only the deaths that have been recovered, which is like, I mean, in so many areas, depending on the weather and animals and things like that, a person can essentially just disappear. So there just is nothing to be found. And once you've, like Ari said, once you've gone on a few searches and found remains, or even search for somebody that ends up just never being found, you had perfect coordinates and you just never find the person, and the family searching for years, it just really makes you start to think it's more like 7 times than 3 times. But so not only is it just the people that are recovered, but there's actually not good data border-wide. Southern Arizona has the medical examiner that keeps track and has sort of like an independent record, but border-wide, essentially the reporters and like whatever numbers we have use Border Patrol's data, and by comparing it with the Humane Borders data, you can see that it's just a really drastic undercount. So the border-wide data that we have is, or even recovered remains, is a total undercount of the actual amount of people that have been found in the desert, and then the people that have actually died is way higher than that even. So we started trying to get data for El Paso County, Hudspeth County in West Texas, and the state of New Mexico, and found just in the past 4 or 5 years that the amount of deaths has skyrocketed to the point where now that area is actually, in terms of like recovered remains, deadlier than Southern Arizona. Just in one county, Doña Ana County, which is west of El Paso, so this isn't even counting El Paso County, it's something like 110 deaths so far this year, mostly just in June and July. So it's just been this incredibly deadly place. But there's been government reports kind of getting Border Patrol in trouble for not accurately counting deaths or including better counts from medical examiners for their data. So Southern Texas, places that don't have these independent observations of the death counts, there's just no real knowledge of exactly how many people are dying. But it's a very, very high number.
Like when I think about No More Deaths work, and as has been brought out, or mentioned at least, water drops along areas where people are known to transit is one thing that y'all are known for, and just like the Border Patrol is known for recording videos of themselves stabbing those water bottles and destroying like food deposits and stuff. And then also providing medical care, as you said, being a first responder, where you're aware of somebody having needs, doing triage work. So No More Deaths activists have faced prosecution in the past for offering aid to people on the move, as I'm assuming non-lawyers yourselves. Can you talk a bit about this and the impact that it's had on the work, and what, if any, legal protection aid workers with groups like No More Deaths, No Mas Muertes claim, like Good Samaritan laws sort of things?
Yeah, I can start with this. So it was 2019, I believe. The Scott Warren case was going on. At the same time, I think the Cabeza Prieta case was also going on. That year in 2020, I think was like the height of so much of legal repression against humanitarian aid workers, not just with No More Deaths, but also at the same time as the Scott Warren case, there was also multiple people on the Tohono O'odham Nation who were facing similar charges for supporting people crossing through the desert with water and food and medical attention. We won those cases, and I think the precedent it has created is that, it reinforces our values and like our fight against death and suffering in the borderlands, that like what we're doing isn't a crime, that what we're doing is humanitarian aid. It's protected under the Religious Freedoms Protection Act, I believe, and that we follow the Red Cross Code of Conduct. That is an international code of conduct for humanitarian aid across the world. I think that No More Deaths has like created this precedent of aid work not being illegal and it doesn't need to be criminalized. And when they have tried criminalizing us for it, they haven't won. And since then, there has been such a big uptick in other aid groups popping up across the borderlands. There's so many podcasts I've listened to of folks like out in California who are like, oh yeah, like this group, No More Deaths, did this thing, and now we're doing aid work, which is not to say that like we started, doing water drops or any of that, because that is not the case. But it's cool to see how these like legal cases that have come from the US government towards us, we've won, have like inspired other people to do this work and not feel like they are going to immediately be criminalized for this. Also want to say it comes with a lot of privilege from a group who is with the church. Especially a lot of aid groups are predominantly white in the southern Arizona borderlands and documented folks as well. And that's really different from what we're seeing and what we have seen on the Tohono O'odham Nation, of nation members being criminalized and jailed for also doing humanitarian aid work. So yeah, it's really hard to do aid work depending on who you are, because racism exists, and it is the system which upholds the border, and it is the system that also criminalizes aid workers too. Bryce, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that was it.
So the last few administrations, federal administrations, have seen increasing deportations through the southern U.S. border, large numbers of detentions in horrendous conditions, escalated tensions between right-wing governors and federal troops in Eagle Creek last year, the busing of immigrants and asylum seekers from southern border states to more northerly states. While the Republicans are especially vitriolic on the subject, this election season has seen ramping up rhetoric and action on both sides of the aisle on the subject of the immigration quote-unquote crisis. Can you talk about the politicization of people on the move and what this means for the people and the communities in the crosshairs?
Well, it's kind of like with the previous question, giving people water is just such basic, it's in the freaking Bible, it's just like the number one, like you don't let people die because they don't have water. And there's groups that like the Samaritans that say like, oh, we're not a political organization. Like we're just doing like, this is very apolitical. We're just giving people water. Like it's not blah, 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 this, that, and the other. But it has become like politicized and criminalized by the governments. And reality kind of seems like, and just the real world just seems like it matters kind of less and less in this political and media environment. So, I mean, it's just so frustrating to see all this stuff come out of like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump both just seem to be kind of like demagogues about it. During the Trump administration, Kamala Harris was yelling about how when she's president, she's gonna be really good to migrants and things like that. And then now, because it seems like maybe the polls show that she should be tougher on immigration, she's saying all these like almost Trumpian anti-immigrant things. And it's really just it's just so divorced from the actual reality on the ground. They've done studies where people think that Biden is actually easy on immigration, which is just like wildly untrue. Even just in the past year, the amount of restrictions on asylum that have directly led to increased deaths of people is just horrific to see. And in terms of like combating that, I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, my hot take is that like migration hasn't become politicized. It is that like migration in its form that it has been in for the last 100 years in the United States was inherently political, because it is like inherently racist and xenophobic, and upholds settler colonialism to the highest degree. So I don't know, it's very funny to me when it's like, oh, well, migration just became political, or like, you don't have to be political with your work. It's like, well, we are, because, the systems that we exist under, force us into that. Like every political stance right now, and that has been the case for so long with every Democratic president, that has been so harsh on migration, and not any different from their Republican counterpart, like hasn't eased up on migration. They haven't, divorced themselves from militarization of the borderlands, from like the death and suffering that people are going through. And yeah, that will not change at all, I think, until we like reimagine a world that exists outside of this current context. And that may be a little tricky to do, in the next few months, most definitely. But yeah, there is going to be like a continued, like violence against migrants and people who flee to this country until we like reevaluate, I think, all of those systems of oppression, of, why people are coming here, of like the harm that U.S. intervention abroad has done. And we haven't done that on a large scale in any meaningful way.
So an important element that feeds into the xenophobic anti-immigrant rhetoric is the directed, semi-independent work of groups like FAIR or Numbers USA and the right-wing media ecosystem that a lot of them pop out of, and social media ecosystem. We've seen how narratives can be shaped quickly to the advantage of fear and anger at conditions directed against immigrants in the USA and the UK recently, and in Ireland and elsewhere, to whip up violence against marginalized populations. In a lot of ways to ignore systematic issues like capitalism, settler colonialism that are causing the actual woes that people are suffering. Do you all have suggestions of how we can get better at pushing counter narratives to these emotionally driven viral moments? Like, it's clear that through your interactions one-on-one with people and in the community that you show how much better it is when we just help each other, and the humanity among all the people engaging there and the inhumanity of these institutions. But just to sort of say, I think that like narrative is important because that's the first contact that people have with a lot of these concerns, which is why it's so easy to create these dehumanizing situations.
I'm often not good at thinking about the big picture and like larger narratives because doing like kind of on the ground work and seeing like these sort of like small scale, like how the big picture ends up affecting the small picture. We're just sort of in it all the time. So like as soon as any event happens, you can almost just like see all these different narratives that already exist, pull that event into whatever their narrative or agenda is. And there's just so many like different groups, like whether they call themselves like liberal or conservative or far right groups that are just kind of sitting there waiting to have literally anything that happens or any like new viewpoint or political decision or anything like that just get pulled into like Border Patrol will say like, oh, all these people died. This just like shows like these horrible smugglers are preying on people and you really just shouldn't come to the United States. It's just too dangerous. Unfortunately, the smugglers have made it too dangerous. And then it's just all these narratives just already exist. And I know like Ari is on the media team and we have our narrative that we, and our viewpoint that we put out there. But in terms of just more, as a more general thing, like, aside from just kind of not wavering from just treating reality as reality, which is like just so clear. I mean, there's just not that many things in my mind that are just this transparent. Like if you actually go see it and talk to a few people that are directly affected, it's just like not that complicated of a thing. And it really takes a huge political and media effort to make it out like it's this sort of, like it's this thing that is super complex and needs to be thought about a whole lot before you have a moral take on it.
Yeah, I think that, what we do on the ground is such a tangible thing that I think for myself personally, it is like, it feels the most helpful, when something is incredibly tangible. And I think that something with border policy and just immigration itself is that it feels so difficult, like so many other struggles that are currently going on, to like find incredibly tangible ways to support each other and support things. And the easiest thing to do and the most supportive thing to do sometimes is support people who are directly affected on a larger scale. Like we will not see the border change until the abolition of the border. We won't see it change until the abolition of the Border Patrol, and until like people have the right and freedom to movement. And how we get there looks like a million small things, like, you know, more people supporting folks with immigration law to push their cases so that in the meantime they have access to safety. You know, more folks doing aid work, more folks talking about what's going on. And yeah, I think maybe that's answering your question. But yeah, it's just, you know, it's a matter of all of these small things in the small ways and like our personal communities, because the border is not just, you know, the US-Mexico border. It is every city that is on the coast is, you know, part of this, like this enforced border. And even as we're seeing now, like with more militarization seeping into the country, whether that's through Border Patrol or like cop cities popping up, and just like the deeper and deeper militarization and like xenophobic and racist rhetoric that is coming from all sides. You know, it's like, how are we all collectively pushing against that within our own communities? Because that's what matters, is like the small things.
Yeah, they got Border Patrol in Pittsburgh now. They got Border Patrol in Portland. They were in 2020. Border Patrol was out there doing heinous stuff to protesters, and I think, yeah, like Ari said, remembering that it's like totally connected with. It's gotten to the point where it's totally connected with kind of all of our struggles and with all of our lives, and even, you know, with Homeland Security and ICE, that's even beyond the supposed border zone. You know, they deport people from neighborhoods in Iowa, you know? So yeah, I think just remembering that this is like just a real nationwide thing that affects literally everybody.
Yeah. It's, I was reading a while ago, Nobody is Protected by Rhys Jones. And it was like talking about the history of Border Patrol and how it developed. And also like opens up with just talking about how like jurisdiction is within 100 miles of any border or port. And I'm sure it extends past that, but like I was curious about how Border Patrol was showing up to be like a brute squad in Portland and how that made sense. But yeah, as you all point to, like the border reaches into the heart of the so-called USA as a settler colonial project through police, prisons, courts, social services, and employment, medical care, like where you're talking about like people being asked for whether or not they have immigration status or what that is when they're visiting a hospital. Yeah, can you talk about how folks can get involved in immigration solidarity, even if they're not in border regions like the Southwest, the so-called USA? I mean, there's like, I know like here in North Carolina, we're pretty far from any of the external borders, and there are groups, there's community centers like Nuestro Centro and SEMA. But yeah, I wonder if, you could talk a little bit about that for folks that aren't in the Southwest, and for folks that are in the Southwest who want to get involved, how people can join up with y'all or other similar groups.
There's immigration, like legal clinics in almost every city. They are usually incredibly understaffed, and a lot of them love volunteers. Those are really great places to start with. It's just like researching legal clinics for immigrants and people seeking asylum, help them go through paperwork, or like, you know, see what other connections they have. Specifically in Arizona, or like in the borderlands itself, from San Diego into Texas, there's so many rad groups doing aid work. There's like Borderlands Relief Collective in San Diego that popped up in like the last few years, I think. Border Kindness is out there. Al Otro Lado does some on the ground work, and then also legal support work out that way. We're out in Tucson, Humane Borders, the Samaritans. Yeah, there's a bunch of folks doing stuff. If you want to get involved with No More Deaths, you can go to our website, click the little volunteer link. We do month-long programs where folks can come out for a full month at a time. We have housing for volunteers, so we'll put folks up in housing. And you come out to the desert, do desert aid, hang out with some nice people, and drive some big trucks. And yeah, you can do that. Bryce, any plugs for New Mexico support?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of organizing going on recently in El Paso, New Mexico. Hope Border Institute is a really great group in El Paso. And then if you look on Instagram, Casa Carmelita has been has started organizing some direct aid that you can get plugged in with, and that's all just kind of like in the process of getting formed. Also say, yeah, in the borderlands region, the militarization kind of goes on both sides of the border. So if you are in one of these border areas, just like a lot of our groups need help, a lot of groups over on the Mexican side need help. There's like in Juarez, I know there's medical clinics and shelters that would love volunteers to come through and support, or just monetary assistance. Most of these groups all need are just based on donations. There's very little government support. And yeah, South Texas Human Rights Center. But yeah, just on the idea of this being sort of like, there's across the nation, there's things you can plug into. Like Ari said, there's legal clinics in every city, but also I know there's a lot of really good mutual aid networks I know of one in Boston whose name I totally forget, but just everywhere where there's people showing up, whether it's asylum seekers or just regular immigrants who are in need of like immediate support. There's a lot of groups that have popped up with needs for housing, with needs for just kind of like keeping people on their feet until they can figure some stuff out, with connecting with jobs, all stuff like that. So I definitely encourage people to just get connected in their own communities. I think there's sort of an idea of like, oh, the border is just death, and people like No More Deaths are on it, or a lot of like anarchists will come down, try to like have a whole thing coming down here and supporting, but the place that they came from is usually in need of support too. And yeah, just Harris and Trump have both threatened mass deportations. So when that comes, I think there's going to be a lot of need for people just literally to be protecting their neighbors physically from getting deported. So I think having networks and groups in place that are just thinking about this, even if they're involved in different struggles, I think is super important.
Yeah, and remembering also that like at the beginning of the Trump administration, the actions that happened, for instance, at airports to block deportations was huge and widespread across all of this terrible nation. People showing up to like stop Muslim ban deportations. Yeah, so you've named a bunch of organizations that we can put links to in the show notes and tag on the social media when we put the episode out. Were there any other groups you wanted to shout out that didn't get a mention, or is there anything else that I didn't ask about that you wanted to mention as we close up the conversation?
Well, one more group in California already had a great list, but the Haitian Bridge Alliance has been doing a lot of really good work recently, especially with the amount of asylum seekers and people from African countries that have been coming in recently. But yeah, I don't know, Ari?
There is an endless amount of groups doing border aid and solidarity in the borderlands, and it compounds my brain to think of the names right now. But yeah, there's so many groups, so many people doing aid work like we do, so many groups who are built up by migrants who have crossed themselves, a lot of the time doing search and rescue and search and recovery. I feel like those groups are like kind of the backbone of civilian SAR in the borderlands. Yeah, there's so many people doing so much. So yeah, highly looking into them, and can like add them in the caption or something.
Yeah, were there any closing thoughts that I didn't ask about, or do we feel good about where we're landing with that?
One thing I want to add, something that just feels incredibly important right now, is that just like recognizing the struggle against death and suffering in the borderlands, and how deeply, deeply connected it is to the struggle for liberation of oppressed people all across the world, specifically right now in Gaza. So yeah, I think when like thinking about freedom and protection and safety for people crossing the border, just also thinking about that on a larger scale, whether it's folks crossing the Mediterranean or people in Poland or people in Gaza, because it is the same systems of oppression everywhere. So yeah, our heart goes out to all of the folks all across the world doing really important work, and to all the oppressed peoples everywhere fighting for liberation, especially right now in Palestine. So just a shout out to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, not just the systems, but the actual infrastructure is the same, like individuals and companies building the walls and surveillance systems in Palestine are building them on the wall here.
Well, thank you, Ari and Bryce, so much for having this conversation, for the work that you do. And I would love to talk to you sometime in the future again and catch up with how things are going.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
The border is not just a wall. It's not just a line on a map. It's a power structure, a system of control. The border does not divide one world from another. There is only one world, and the border is tearing it apart. The Ex-Worker Podcast presents No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America. A serialized audiobook in 11 chapters. Tune in at crimethink.com/podcast.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
I write and record this after 2 days of watching the Democratic National Convention. For context, my current now is after the night that the Obamas spoke. Also, for the record, I'm not speaking to you in my capacity as a candidate whose campaign videos are posted on Instagram at RealSwaniac1969. I'm speaking as a commentator, a gonzo journalist hopped up on 40 ounces of coffee. Make that 60. We are deep into election season, and election season is much different than, say, deer season or rabbit season. With most seasons, you get to shoot things. During election season, you only get to shoot candidates in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Election season is a big deal for poor deluded hierarchs. It's their opportunity to give away their personal power, their autonomy, and their sovereignty to total strangers who will subject them and us to subjugation for the next 4 years. Hierarchs love nothing more than they love the chance to collectively disempower themselves. They see this as democracy and freedom. But the reality is, their democracy starts with duh, and their freedom ends in dumb. Watching the political process play out, this time with much greater access to the details of every event than I've ever witnessed before due to getting cable, I've been fascinated by it all. I watched the Republican National Convention and so far half of the Democratic National Convention. And I've been paying attention to all of the polling that shows the margins nationally and the margins in the critical swing states, as well as the breakdowns as to who is voting for whom and why. It's quite revealing about us humans, and it's had me pondering. The two major political parties present to all of us a kind of binary. The parties split their positions. If one of them is for something, the other party is against. And generally, their positions are pretty absolute. Not a lot of gray area. Abortion, taxes, immigration, and so on. The parties give an either or. And so the population then chooses teams. Some go to either and some go to or. Also, it appears that people choose one party over another because the party of their choosing shares their values, whatever those values are. And when they choose one party over the other, they become convinced that the other party does not share their values. What we end up with are two factions of humans who believe that everyone in their faction shares their values, and that everyone in the other faction not only does not share their values, but vehemently rejects their values, opposes them. I would suggest that both groups of deluded hierarchs overinflate their differences. I would suggest that most hierarchs probably share the same set of core values but differ only in priorities. Their priorities of those values are simply in a different order. For example, someone opposing choice does not necessarily hate women or hate freedom, but they prioritize the lives of the unborn higher than they prioritize personal freedom. While someone pro-choice doesn't want to kill babies, they simply prioritize personal freedom higher than they prioritize the rights of someone who does not even exist yet. Often, but not always, they have the same values, just different priorities. But don't tell them. We need them to keep fighting each other. We can throw in a few machetes and they'll accomplish the next revolution for us. We'll just have to mop up the blood when they're done. But I digress. It seems that people really believe that one party or another is really better than the other in serving the people's interests. That one party's candidates, whichever one they choose, will make the world a better place, and that the other party's candidate will make the world worse. And it seems they really believe that. I think they all completely misunderstand the real purpose of political parties. Both parties are corporations. They're in competition, much like Coke and Pepsi, or McDonald's and Burger King. Each party presents its brand in the hopes of gaining and accumulating and maintaining more than their adversary. Unlike the battle between Coke and Pepsi or between McDonald's and Burger King, the battle between the two corporate parties is not one for monetary profit. They're not attempting to accumulate more wealth than their opponent. They're trying to accumulate more power. Power is the prize in this battle, not money. Otherwise, Democrats and Republicans, as parties, are Coke and Pepsi, McDonald's and Burger King. They roll out their brands, they market themselves, they attempt to create a kind of identity, a social space to exist in, a package of ideas around their products. And they do it not with an aim to make the world a better place. They don't care about that. If anything good comes from what their candidates actually accomplish, that's just a happy accident. Neither corporation is in the making the world better business. They're in the accumulation of power business. So neither of them promote particular candidates and policies and talking points because they will save the world. They promote candidates and policies and talking points because they believe those will increase their power, will increase the amount of control they have over our world. Poor deluded hierarchs are mesmerized, enthralled, and hypnotized by the hype, by the smokescreen. They really see the binary in terms of good and bad, in terms of saving the world or destroying the world, when really they should be seeing the two corporate parties more like they see Coke and Pepsi, McDonald's and Burger King. Then they would come to the same conclusion as all of the machete-wielding, ski-mask-clad, dumpster-burning, savage cannibal maniacs out there, that both parties are enslaving us and destroying our world, and only through direct action can we stop them. There's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They both make terrible masters, and they both make good hostages. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.
Orillas de la suerte.